The Man Who Transformed a Village. The incredible story of Don Joaquin and his forest. High in the mountains of San Cristobal de las Casas, where the sky blurs into persistent mists and the paths wind like open scars on the earth's skin, there stood a village suspended in time. Its dusty streets, adobe houses cracked by the years, and the weathered faces of its inhabitants silently spoke of a more fertile past, of a yesterday that would never return. It was a place where clocks seemed to have forgotten to move forward, and sighs mingled with the dry wind descending from the hills. In a house with walls stained by smoke and memories, he lived. Once tall, now bent by the weight of accumulated winters, he still carried in his eyes an intensity that belied the frailty of his bones. The palm hat he wore was more than an accessory. It was an inheritance from his father and a shield against a sun that no longer warmed the same. He walked with measured steps, without hurry or hope, but with the stubbornness of one who has made peace with pain. With each step, the ground seemed to yield slightly beneath his worn boots, as if recognizing the tired soul that tread upon it. The dawns belonged to him. Before the first rooster crowed or the sky began to dissolve its blackness, he was already up. In the dim light of his room, surrounded by photographs covered in a thin layer of dust, he would take his bag of seeds and the old shovel that, like him, had survived many battles. He wrapped himself in his ruana and stepped out without saying a word, for it had been many years since there was anyone left to say anything to. The house, silent as an abandoned temple, bore witness to his routine. Boil water, take a sip of coffee that did not always fill the cup, and depart with the same goal as every day. At the top of the hill, where the air was thinner and the silence deeper, his work began. The soil was hard, almost hostile, cracked like the lips of a feverish child. But he dug with rough and trembling hands, dropping seed after seed, covering them as if they were precious jewels the world was not yet worthy of. No one knew for sure why he did it. Sometimes they watched him from their houses, with curiosity or disdain, as one watches those who have lost their minds. "What are you looking for so early, Don Joaquin?" a young man would ask while sweeping the dust from his doorway. He would reply without stopping, without even looking, "Planting dreams, son, planting dreams." But in that village forgotten by time, dreaming had become a luxury. There were no longer children running through the streets, nor patron saint festivals painting the walls with music. The young people, tired of hunger and broken promises, had left for the city, for the United States, or anywhere else where money fell from trees instead of dry leaves. Those who remained were old men who spoke with their dead, women who sold beans with resignation tattooed on their foreheads, and him, the man of seeds, who refused to give up. The land, once generous, had become an expanse of abandonment. The trees that once shaded the paths were now rotten stumps, victims of relentless axes. The streams that in his childhood ran singing among the stones were dry grooves populated by lizards and memories. The once fertile earth responded with indifference to the peasants' pleas, returning to them thin ears of corn and yellowing leaves. As he walked alone, he remembered. He did not need to close his eyes to see his wife sitting by the stove, humming songs no one sang anymore. She still spoke to him, in whispers that seemed to come from the wind. She reminded him of how they had planted their first corn together, how they had danced in the rain without fear of the mud, how they laughed the day their first child was born, and cried the night they watched them leave. The children, those who had promised to return, who swore they would write, but who dissolved in the cities like salt in hot water. The last envelope had arrived more than 10 years ago. Inside, a blurry photograph and a bill that wasn't even enough for fertilizer. After that, nothing. Only the echo of the mailman who no longer passed, and the bitter certainty that blood is forgotten when hunger and success take hold. But he could not forget, because in every seed he buried was the name of one of them. Because while the village was dying slowly, he felt that he could still do something, not for himself, who had already lived more than he had expected, but for those who might one day return looking for shade and find not even a leaf. The earth always gives, Joaquin, but you have to care for it like a child, his father had once told him, while teaching him how to graft a peach tree. That phrase remained with him like an invisible scar. That is why, every time his knees cracked as he descended into the furrow, every time the sun bit his neck and sweat clouded his vision, he kept going. Because for him, planting was not an agricultural act, it was an act of faith, an intimate ceremony where the altar was dust and the prayers were said with hands. That day, on his way back from the hill, he passed in front of Doña Lupe's store. The woman, with a stained apron and blackened nails from so much corn, looked at him with that mixture of mockery and compassion reserved for the lost. "You sure have patience, Don Joaquin, but you're too old to be playing with shovels. That land won't even grow grass." He barely looked at her, without anger, without contempt. Someone has to do it. And he kept walking, as always. The afternoons would find him sitting on a wobbly chair at the door of his house, watching the horizon as if waiting for a sign. Sometimes he spoke to the plants, other times to the stones, and occasionally to the portrait of his wife that hung crooked on the wall. The town mocked him, but he knew that madness was not talking to the absent, but having completely forgotten how to listen. At night, when the sky filled with indifferent stars and the cold seeped into his bones, he would think about what could be. In his mind, he saw towering trees covering the hills, children climbing their branches, women filling pitchers with fresh water, and a town no longer ashamed of its land. It was not a fantasy. It was a vision, as real to him as the shovel he leaned against his bed each night. He knew no one else understood, but that didn't stop him. When the soul has found its purpose, it no longer seeks approval. And even if the world turned its back on him, as long as he had the strength to lift the shovel and enough love for one more seed, he would keep planting. That village, perched among cliffs and memories, was a place where time slowly dissolved, like old adobe when the rain that hardly came anymore touched it. The walls of the houses looked chipped, as if hope itself had peeled off in fragments with each passing season. On the corners, where once children played games and women wove while sharing stories, now there were only empty benches and skinny dogs dozing with hunger gnawing at their bellies. The mountains that had once embraced the town with a maternal green were now bare hills, scarred by decades of careless logging, by the flight of generations who, finding nothing to harvest, left in search of shade elsewhere. Every step he took on those streets felt like a contradiction. His body dragged on, tired, but his gaze remained firm. He saw what others no longer wanted to see. Where they saw dust, he imagined deep roots. Where they felt resignation, he found fertile ground for faith. That difference, invisible but profound, isolated him, not as punishment, but as the natural consequence of someone who decides to keep walking when everyone else has chosen to sit. As he passed through the town square, some eyes followed him. They were not looks of hatred, nor even open mockery, but that bitter mix of misunderstanding and pity. The women still selling in the square, with faded aprons and hands hardened by work, murmured among themselves while arranging beans on plastic sheets. "There goes the crazy man with the shovel again," one of them whispered, without malice but with no intention of understanding. Poor man. He lost his mind since his wife died, and with those kids who don't even remember him. And while the words evaporated in the smoke of the griddle, he kept walking, oblivious, or perhaps already immune to the comments. Because, in his world, those murmurs were not louder than the whisper of the earth crying for water, nor more painful than the silence of an empty home. On hot days, which were becoming longer and drier, he would stop under what little shade remained. Sometimes at the corner of the temple, where an old dying ash tree still stood, he would take out a small notebook with frayed covers. There he wrote, without order or rules. He drew route diagrams, wrote phrases he shared with no one, and counted the days since he had planted the first seed. Not because he expected to see the trees grow to their full height, but because he needed to convince himself that every act, no matter how small, had an echo beyond flesh and bones. Loneliness was no stranger to him. He had learned to live with it like one learns to walk with a stone in their shoe. At first, it hurts, but over time it becomes part of the body. What hurt him most was not the physical abandonment of his children, but the emotional abandonment, the disconnection that had grown deeper than any geographic distance. He knew they had their reasons, that the city absorbed them with its false lights and relentless clocks. But even so, he waited, not for letters, because those no longer came, not for calls, because the line was gone. He waited for one of them to return someday, to see what he had been trying to build with his trembling hands, to understand that his struggle was not against the drought, but against oblivion. That particular day, while digging next to a large stone at the top of the hill, he felt a cramp in his back that forced him to stop. He sat down carefully on a dry root, breathing slowly, letting the sweat cool on his forehead. He looked around. The view was wide, majestic even in its decay. Cracked hills, dead trees raising their branches like pleading arms, and a sky so blue it hurt. Amid that landscape of desolation, his recent furrows were merely fresh wounds, faint lines of promise on an exhausted body. With a slowness he could no longer avoid, he took a seed from his satchel. He examined it carefully. It was small, imperfect, covered with a film of soil that seemed impossible to remove. And yet, when he buried it gently, he did so with a tenderness no longer seen even in hospitals. "You won't let me down," he whispered, barely audible, as if afraid the wind might steal his faith. The sun was setting as he began the walk back. His legs ached, the reed cane was not enough to ease the fatigue, but something in his chest still beat with resolve. As he passed by one of the most deteriorated houses in the village, he heard a deep voice from inside. That old man should be in a rocking chair, not out there playing with dirt. Another voice, younger, replied without conviction, "Yeah, but at least he's doing something. Better that than just watching everything fall apart." He stopped for a second, only to listen better, but said nothing. He knew that sometimes even the harshest words held a seed of recognition. When he reached his house, he paused in front of the door before going in. Climbing the 3 stone steps was becoming harder each time, and the creak of the wood as it opened seemed like a bitter welcome whisper. Inside, it smelled of extinguished firewood and clothes no longer worn. On the table, a photo framed behind dirty glass showed his wife carrying a basket of quelities, smiling as if she knew he would someday need that memory to go on. That night, as the fire crackled timidly, the wind slipped through the cracks in the roof with the lament of the absent. The cup of coffee trembled in his hands, not from the cold. He thought about the little he had, the much he had lost, and what he still believed possible. Because something inside him, a quiet but tenacious voice, told him that the land could still respond, that it was still time to plant even if no one else believed. That even if the trees did not grow enough to give him shade, they could shelter others when he was no longer there. And so, while the village slept, oblivious and defeated, he closed his eyes with the certainty that, even if his bones bent like old branches, his will was still putting down roots. The sky changed without warning, as it often does in places where the earth has forgotten how to read the signs of time. For days, the heat had been relentless, the kind that cracks the ground and dries lips until they bleed. The dust, suspended in the air like a silent threat, crept into clothes, eyes, lungs. But then came the wind, different, laden with a thick, electric humidity that made the birds fall silent. Don Joaquin felt it before anyone else. As he gathered the last seeds, he noticed the air was no longer the same. The metallic smell of the sky foretold something violent, an outburst. That afternoon, he did not climb the hills as usual. He stayed home, restless, watching through the window the slight trembling of the leaves in the dry shrubs. From time to time, thunder rumbled in the distance like an ancient beast returning from exile. When the first drop fell, he stood up without a word, took his hat, and went outside. The rain came with fury, not as a blessing, but as punishment. It was a raging storm, without rhythm or mercy, as if the sky had held back too much and finally decided to spit it all out at once. The The wind ripped off tin roofs, felled branches, made doors dance with desperation. Some in the village came out to secure their windows. Others simply prayed from their beds, fearing the mountain would collapse. He ran, or at least tried. His legs no longer obeyed as before, but his soul pushed him toward the hill, where his small sprouts slept, where his silent work had begun to take shape. Each step in the mud was a struggle, each stride a battle against age. The water lashed his face, soaked his bones, but he did not stop. When he arrived, what he saw took his breath away. The rows he had planted so carefully were disfigured, broken, as if a giant hand had clawed the earth. Some of the young trees lay on the ground, split in half, their roots exposed like broken veins. Others had simply disappeared, swept away by the current that snaked down the slope. He knelt without strength, without voice, with arms hanging like defeated branches. The drops blended with the tears falling unresisted. He remained like that for a long time, surrounded by the roar of the downpour, by the murmur of the earth swallowing mud, as if the world were mocking his effort. He wanted to scream, but found no words. Only a murmur, a broken confession, escaped his lips. Maybe this isn't for me. Images crowded his mind. The lonely mornings, the dust in his throat, the veiled mockery from the villagers, the portrait of his wife by the stove, the days when his hands were strong and his back didn't ache. All that effort, all that faith cast to the ground like the broken branches lying before him. For the first time in a long time, he felt he was losing, not to nature, not to the trees, but to himself. He returned home soaked, with mud on his boots, and his soul dragging behind. That night, he did not light the stove. He sat in the wooden chair that creaked as if it, too, felt the weight of defeat, and he remained silent, watching the shadows moving on the wall like ancient ghosts. The rain continued outside, pounding the roof, dragging away what little remained standing. But inside him, there was no longer rage, only a deep exhaustion, the kind that no sleep can cure. Dawn arrived with a deceptive calm. The clouds still hung in the sky like rags, but the wind had gone. The earth, however, continued to cry. He went out slowly, each muscle protesting, each step a reminder that the body has memory. When he reached the hills, he stopped. He said nothing. He just observed. The disaster was real, but in the middle of the chaos, something was moving. A sprout, small, trembling, soaked, but alive. He approached. He touched the leaves with his fingertips, with that tenderness one reserves for the fragile, and then something inside him changed. It wasn't an epiphany, nor a heavenly voice, but a quiet, serene certainty. The storm had destroyed much, but not everything. And as long as a single seed survived, there was a future. He stood with difficulty. The mud clung to his ankles, but it didn't matter. His body was still old, but his will had found a new route. He picked up the shovel again, not to start from scratch, but to continue. What he didn't see was the boy watching him from behind a rock, his clothes still wet from the storm, and his eyes wide open. He was thin, one of those who seemed to break with a gust of wind, but his expression showed something unseen among the adults in the village: curiosity. He had followed the old man without being noticed, from the plaza to the hills, and now he watched him dig as if it were a sacred ritual. He stepped a little closer, with slow steps, until the words came out without thinking. "Why do you come back if everything already fell apart?" He looked up. He didn't seem surprised, as if he had been waiting for that voice. "Because there's still one left standing," and he buried the shovel into the wet earth again. The boy said nothing. He stayed a while longer, in silence, and then left. That night, Don Joaquin returned to the stove. He lit a flame, boiled water, and for the first time in several days, he felt accompanied, not by someone visible, but by a possibility. Maybe change didn't begin with trees or seeds. Maybe it all began when someone watched and decided to stay. The sun returned with its usual dryness, warm but merciless, as if the storm had been nothing more than a fleeting nightmare. The slope still bore the furrows of destruction, the open scars left by the uncontrollable rain, but among the mounds of disturbed earth, small green shoots began to appear. Don Joaquin, with his stiff back and still aching hands, climbed the hill again with the same shovel that now seemed part of his body. He carried it like an old warrior who won't release his sword, not out of glory, but out of habit. That day, silence accompanied him. A different kind, less heavy, as if the wind, which caressed the bare tops of the trees still standing, whispered promises instead of laments. Upon reaching the summit, he looked for the places where the seeds had resisted. There weren't many, but they were there. Small, fragile, clinging with a stubbornness only life understands. He touched them one by one, removing stones, adjusting the soil around them as if cradling a newborn. The sound of footsteps on damp earth pulled him from his focus. It wasn't common for someone to climb up. He turned slowly, the sun making him squint, and there he was, the boy from the day before, in the same poorly washed clothes and hair tousled by the wind. This time, he wasn't hiding. He walked straight toward him, with curiosity still intact on his face. "Good morning, Don Joaquin," he said with that mix of shyness and determination known only to children of the countryside. He nodded, not distrustfully, but with the caution of someone who has learned that company does not always stay. "You came alone?" "Yes. My mom doesn't know I came. I thought maybe I could help." Joaquin lowered the shovel. He wasn't used to company. For years he had done everything alone, planting, watering, waiting. But the boy's gaze was different. There was no mockery, no pity, none of that condescension adults used when talking to him. There was hunger, yes, but not for food. A hunger to learn, to belong to something. "Do you know how to water with a bucket?" The boy smiled. "My grandpa taught me before he got sick. He can't walk anymore, but he says the land doesn't forget who loves it." In that instant, something loosened in the old man's chest. A fiber hardened by loneliness trembled. Without saying more, he handed him the bucket, not as a symbolic gesture, but as one who transfers responsibility. Together they walked to the spring that still held some water after the storm. It was a timid trickle, but enough. The boy, despite his small frame, carried the bucket with both hands, his arms trembling from the weight, but he did not let go. As they watered the sprouts one by one, he watched him. Every movement, every gesture. He didn't need to tell the boy what to do. The child seemed to understand instinctively. When they finished, they sat under the brief shade of a newly grown tree. The wind played with the leaves, and for a moment, the air was filled with a simple peace. Why do you plant trees if you're already old? It wasn't a question with malice, but one of brutal honesty. Joaquin took his time to respond. He was not a man of quick words. "Because someone planted the trees I enjoyed when I was a child. Because this land was good to us, but we have left it alone. And because if no one plants today, there will be no shade tomorrow." The boy nodded, but frowned as if trying to process something deeper. "And don't you get tired every day? But there are wearinesses that weigh less than abandonment. And this you see here, is all I have left." The boy was silent. His silence was not empty, but respectful. He was learning, without knowing it, to see the world through the eyes of someone who had lost much and still kept giving. From that day on, he came back, not always at the same hour, but he never missed a day. He climbed the hills without telling anyone, with the bucket in one hand and a small toy shovel that was soon replaced with a real one. He learned to distinguish good soil from barren, to identify when a seed needed more shade or when a sprout could withstand the wind. They didn't talk much. Words were scarce between them, like water, but precious. "What happened to your children?" he asked one afternoon while removing stones from a plot. Joaquin did not raise his gaze. "They left, like everyone. They looked for a place where work brings money. Here, it only brings roots and memories. Aren't they coming back? I don't know." The boy lowered his head. He didn't insist. But from that moment on, he cared for each sprout, as if it depended on him that the old man would not be alone again. The village soon noticed the boy's routine. Some laughed, others murmured, "Look at that, the old man got himself a helper. That boy should be in school, not playing up in the hills." But he didn't listen. Or if he did, he didn't care, because something had awakened in his chest, a flame he didn't know before. The idea that effort could leave a mark, that not everything was lost. One afternoon, after watering, they sat to eat a piece of tortilla he had brought hidden in his satchel. Joaquin, who barely ate out of habit, accepted the bite as if it were a delicacy. "Do you think the trees will grow tall?" asked the boy, his eyes shining. He smiled, with that quiet tenderness that only those who have loved deeply can retain. "They'll be taller than the ones before, because you are taking care of them." It wasn't a prediction. It was a promise. And so, without signing anything, without saying it aloud, they sealed a pact, one made of earth, sweat, and silence. Because when a child begins to listen to the wind and an old man decides to trust another heart, life finds meaning again. Dawn came wrapped in mist, thick and dense like a sigh refusing to dissipate. The hills were still marked by the storm, but beneath the cracked surface, invisible forces had begun to stir. The surviving seeds, nourished by the water and protected by tireless hands, began to claim their place. Don Joaquin, as every morning, climbed the slope with slow but steady steps, the shovel in one hand and the seed satchel slung over his shoulder. Next to him, Emiliano carried a bucket of water and an improvised sack of moist soil. They no longer walked in silence as before. Sometimes they spoke little, sometimes not at all, but something between them had been woven stronger than words, the shared certainty that what they were doing mattered. That morning, without warning, a second pair of steps joined the path. It was a girl with long braids, her feet covered by huaraches too big for her eyes alert and bright. Her name was Maria, and she was Emiliano's neighbor. She had heard from him the stories about the hill, about the seeds hidden like treasures, about the rain that could not wash away hope. Her mother forbade her to go up, told her it was dangerous, that it wasn't for girls. But curiosity won out. "Can I help?" she asked firmly, without hesitation. Don Joaquin looked her over from head to toe, not as one who judges, but as one wondering whether destiny might begin like this, with a simple question. "Do you know how to use a hoe?" he replied, not kindly nor harshly, just truthfully. She shook her head, but didn't look down. "But I can learn." And she did. Not in a day, nor a week. She learned to fall without crying, to lift stones without expecting someone else to do it, to respect silence when the wind spoke. Emiliano looked at her at first with suspicion, as if his once exclusive world were being invaded. But over time, Maria's presence became natural. When one grew tired, the other carried the water. When one doubted a route, the other inspected it. It was then that the hill began to transform, not because the trees were growing, which were still just green whispers in the soil, but because of the constant movement of those three bodies on the mountain. Other village children began to follow them, at first out of curiosity, then out of habit, and finally out of conviction. One brought an empty bottle for water, another a sack of chicken manure for fertilizer, a girl a pair of gloves from her father. Everyone contributed what they could, as if they knew, even without fully understanding, that they were building something bigger than themselves. Laughter began to fill the mornings. Not empty laughter, but that which is born of shared effort, of mud-caked feet and hands scratched by thorns. Joaquin, who had forgotten the sound of play, sometimes found himself smiling unknowingly, letting fragments of tenderness escape that he thought he had lost. He didn't become a grandfather to them, nor did he intend to. But in his movements, in the way he taught them to plant, there was something paternal, a silent care, an invisible protection. "Roots grow downward first," he explained one day while showing how to place a seed. "Before anything grows toward the sky, it needs to take hold in darkness. We are the same." The children listened to him like one listens to an ancient story, the kind not found in books, but etched forever. Meanwhile, the village watched. The women who swept the sidewalks no longer just murmured about the old man and his obsession. Now they commented that the children from the hill returned tired but smiling, their eyes glowing with a different light. Some men, used to spending the afternoons at the store between lukewarm beers and endless complaints, began to ask why their children no longer spent much time at home. What are they doing up there? Why do they go every day? They say they're planting, with that old man who lives alone, that they're making a forest. The laughter came soon, but it was less fierce, more uncertain, because although many wouldn't admit it, something had begun to change. One morning, while watering a row of new sprouts, Emiliano suddenly stopped, frowning. What if no one else joins Don Joaquin? What if, when we grow up, everything dries up again? The old man put down the shovel, wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, and sat on a stone. Then you'll have to teach those who come after, because trees, like ideas, are also inherited, and a single forest, well cared for, can teach many how to start again. Maria, sitting beside him, looked toward the distant line where green had begun to reclaim ground from the drought. She said nothing, but the way she squeezed the earth between her fingers spoke louder than any promise. The day a group of children arrived with a school teacher to see what they were doing, they realized their efforts were no longer invisible. The teacher, a young man who had returned to the village out of necessity, not vocation, stood silently, observing the work of the past weeks. At first, he seemed skeptical, even uncomfortable, but after listening to the children explain how they planted, how they protected each sprout, how they kept records in a notebook with loose sheets, something in his expression softened. This is more than a natural science lesson, he murmured. This is what should be taught. From that day on, some Fridays the school children began to come as well. Sometimes with a teacher, other times just with permission, but always with the enthusiasm of those who felt part of something sacred. The budding forest became a classroom without a roof, where the earth was a blackboard and the roots the deepest text. Don Joaquin no longer climbed alone. His steps were still slow, but he no longer dragged his feet. He didn't need to say much. Just watching the children run up the hill with buckets and seeds, seeing their dirty hands full of pride, he knew the hardest seed had already germinated. Awareness. And although the trees were still small, each shadow beginning to stretch over the earth was silent proof that they were planting much more than a future. The sun rose differently over those hills. It no longer scorched with the same fury, nor reflected off the bare earth with that glare that stung both eyes and soul. Now its light filtered through budding leaves, dancing over soil that was starting to breathe again. The sprouts that once hid for fear of the wind now stood upright with a timid but firm dignity. And the young trees, though still far from being lush, whispered promises with every movement of their branches in the wind. Don Joaquin now sat more often on the flat stones along the path, not from weakness but for contemplation. He watched how the children climbed the hills without fear, their hands full of earth and their eyes shining. They were no longer just Emiliano and Maria. Each week, more arrived. Some with their parents, others with curious neighbors. One brought a sack of compost, another a handful of seeds gathered from their grandmother's yard. Sometimes they brought nothing but their eagerness, and that was enough. The mountain was beginning to speak again. The hum of insects resumed its murmur among the branches, and birds, which for years had flown far in search of refuge, returned in small groups, perching on what were still adolescent branches. The stream, once just a dry scar, began to drop its first trickles over the cracked stones. They were merely threads, like timid tears, but the earth absorbed them with thirst. The sound of water was, for Joaquin, like hearing the echo of a forgotten song. He stopped before the new current, his face bathed in light and moisture. He didn't cry, because tears were no longer necessary. There was something more powerful in that moment: certainty. The adults began to notice the transformation, first with skepticism, then with surprise, and finally with a mix of admiration and shame. Some approached with vague questions, others merely observed from a distance, as if afraid of catching an enthusiasm that had long felt foreign to them. "What if this actually works?" they asked, in hushed voices, seated on the benches in the square. "What if that old man was right?" A man named Rogelio was the first to take a step. His hands were rough from years of masonry work and his voice hoarse from years of silence. One day, he showed up on the hill with a pickaxe over his shoulder and, without saying a word, began to dig beside Joaquin. They exchanged only a glance, but it was enough. Then came Eustaquia, the owner of the mill, who brought bags of fermented corn husks as fertilizer. After that, Pedro the butcher, who lent his donkey to carry buckets of water. The hill became the new center of the village. It was no longer just a place to observe from afar, nor a solitary cause. It was the space where tired hands regained strength, where children taught without meaning to, and where the elderly rediscovered their dignity. There was no music, no speeches, no celebrations, only the sound of shovels, laughter, and soil being turned. Joaquin watched it all without changing his essence. He still spoke little, but his gestures were more open. Sometimes he even laughed with a coarse voice that seemed to have been locked up for a long time. One of those afternoons, while placing stones around a sprout to protect it from the wind, a woman approached him. She wore a large hat, an old dress, and her gaze lowered. "Do you remember me?" she asked timidly. It took him a few seconds to recognize her. It was Dolores, his wife's sister, whom he hadn't seen since the funeral. She had new wrinkles and dark circles that spoke of difficult nights. "My grandson comes up here every day to help. He told me that you're making the mountain come alive again." He didn't know what to say. The word rebirth sounded immense, as if it didn't belong to him, but it also felt fair. "The mountain is only remembering what it used to be," he replied, without arrogance. She nodded and handed him a bag with lunch. Tortillas, beans, a bit of cheese. "Thank you for teaching my grandson what I didn't know how to give him." The humility of that gesture struck him deeper than anything else, because he understood they were not only planting trees, but restoring what the earth had carried with it. Broken ties, prolonged silences, the guilt no one dared name. The workdays grew longer. Mornings were no longer enough. Sometimes they stayed until sunset, watching how the sun dyed the tender treetops gold. The hills, once deserted, were now furrows of collective labor, green brushstrokes on a canvas that had been empty for too long. The children asked when they would see fruit, when there would be enough shade to hang a hammock, when the deer those some elders remembered seeing run free in their childhood would return. "Take your time," Joaquin said. "Trees don't rush, but they don't give up either." And over time, the adults began to say the same. In market conversations, during visits to the mill, in impromptu meetings under rooftops, people began using words that had vanished from everyday vocabulary. Earth, hope, tomorrow. One afternoon, Emiliano approached Joaquin, while the others carried buckets. "Last night I dreamed the trees were so tall they touched the clouds. And what did you see from up there?" the old man asked. The boy hesitated for a moment, as if unsure if it was right to say it. "I saw the village, but not like it is now. It was full of color. Everyone was laughing, and there was water everywhere." Joaquin looked at him for a long moment before replying, "Then we must keep planting, because that dream can come down from the clouds, if we take care of it." And they kept working, as if time didn't weigh on them, as if memory didn't ache, because they understood that in every seed there was a possibility, and in every sprout a story waiting to be written. The mountains, for the first time in years, were beginning to resemble the future. The young trees swayed to the rhythm of a soft breeze, stretching their leaves toward the sky as if they knew they were no longer alone. The once bare and dusty hill was now an irregular tapestry of greens, light, dark, vibrant. The muddy furrows had become paths. The stream flowed with a steady, clean thread of water, and some birds were building nests among the tender branches. At the top, a broader shadow began to cover the earth with a vegetal tenderness. and that village withered by years of neglect, looked toward the mountain with a respect it did not yet dare to name. Don Joaquin now walked more slowly. His bones complained more frequently, and the reed cane had become indispensable, not just as physical support, but as an extension of his will. Even so, he climbed every day with the same determination that had driven him from the beginning. He no longer dug with the strength of before, but he still knew where to plant, how to precisely cover the seed, how much shade each sprout needed. At his side, Emiliano, taller, stronger, more resolute, carried the water, the fertilizer, and the hope. It was during a cloudy morning, when the air smelled of damp earth and suspended time, that change came from the least expected place. While placing stones around a young tree to protect it from the wind, he heard his name, "Dad." The voice came like a whisper that didn't belong to the wind. When he turned around, he blinked several times. In front of him, with road-stained clothes and a face hardened by the years, stood one of his sons, Ernesto, the eldest, the one who left with promises of sending money, of coming back when things were better, and from whom he hadn't heard in over a decade. Beside him, another familiar face, Gabriel, the second son, with fewer grey hairs than him, but eyes just as tired. Behind them, a young woman, Ernesto's daughter, he knew instantly carried a sleeping baby in her rebozo. He said nothing, no reproach, no tears. He just looked at them, as if seeing someone step out of an old dream, as if he still didn't quite believe they were there. They didn't speak immediately either. The sight of their father, covered in dust and sweat, surrounded by young trees, left them speechless. They had remembered him as old, yes, but not like this. Upright in dignity, possessing something they couldn't fully understand. "They told us what you've done," said Gabriel, breaking the silence. "A teacher around here spoke of the forest. We didn't believe it at first. But look at you, Dad. Just look." Don Joaquin didn't respond. He walked over to the tallest tree, one he had planted the year before and which already towered over him. He touched it with his open palm, as one points to a wound that has begun to heal. "I didn't do this alone." The silence was long, filled with things left unsaid, until Ernesto lowered his gaze, defeated by a shame he could no longer hide. "We forgot about you, Dad. I know. I wanted to come back sooner, but I didn't know how." The old man nodded, not as immediate forgiveness, but in understanding. He knew well what it meant to carry guilt, how it clung to the skin, how heavy it felt in the chest. "There's no shade without roots," he murmured, "and one doesn't grow unless they return to the land that saw them born." Emiliano then approached, with a bucket in one hand and a restrained smile. He looked at the newcomers with the clean curiosity of someone who does not yet know the weight of resentment. Joaquin introduced him without ceremony. "This is Emiliano." Without him, none of this would be standing. The boy greeted them without shyness. The sons looked at each other, recognizing in the young one something they had lost, the ability to admire, to believe. And perhaps for the first time since their arrival, they understood that their father was not alone by choice, but out of necessity. The following days were like a cycle being reconfigured. Ernesto and Gabriel began climbing with him each morning. They didn't say much, as if words still felt too big for them. But their hands began to dig into the soil, their backs to bend over the furrows, their feet to adapt to the rhythm of the hill. They didn't understand everything their father did, but they imitated him. They followed him like children, trying to recover the forgotten language of their childhood. One afternoon, while planting a pair of acacias together, Gabriel stopped and looked at him intently. "Why did you never tell us about this? About what you dreamed?" Joaquin left the shovel stuck in the earth. He sat on a stone and, for the first time in years, let his voice flow freely. "Because I thought you no longer wanted to know anything about this place. Because it hurt more to tell you what we were losing than to stay silent. And because I learned that you can't make anyone stay where they find no reason to." "And now?" insisted Ernesto. "Now you're here." And that was all the answer they needed. The neighbors, seeing the old man's sons climbing and descending the hill, silenced their rumors. Some began to climb as well, driven by curiosity or by a secret desire to repair what time and abandonment had damaged. Small work groups formed in the afternoons, after the mill or the market. On Sundays, children brought their grandparents, and the stories began to be told again under the shade of trees that now offered relief. One of those evenings, when the sky seemed to melt into orange and purple tones, Joaquin watched his sons as they placed a fence around the new sprouts. Emiliano, now older, guided the younger ones just as he had once been guided. And the old man, heart full and eyes misty, understood that the forest, the effort, the struggle, none of it belonged to him anymore. It was all theirs now, everyone's. Because his legacy was not only what had grown beneath the soil, but what had blossomed among those who, at last, had chosen to return.